Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live stream, Existential Delight, episode 22. Today I'll be working through what I think is one of G.K. Chesterton's most underrated poems. This is probably not going to be a very long episode, but I will be going through the poem and just breaking it down and sharing some thoughts with you guys, because it's such a beautiful poem that I fear not enough people might know about it. And this is my one small way of proliferating Chestertonian thought in the world. So let's have a look at it. On the screen, you should see in just a moment the actual poem, and it is called The Song of the Strange Ascetic. Now, before I explain, or before I even go through the poem, I should just preempt it by pointing out a few things. First of all, the poem is going to be teasing, poking fun at the heathenist who is a heathen, but doesn't appreciate the fun that comes with that. And there's a beautiful lesson in this. So even under the title on the screen where it says The Song of the Strange Ascetic, you'll see just underneath that Chesterton can't understand the heathen who isn't even having any fun. So, of course, the most basic question to ask just to begin with is, what do we mean by a heathen? So if you actually Google heathenism, it's going to give you the following, which is that heathenism is a belief or practice of heathens, and heathenism is essentially a religion that honors the ancient Norse, Anglo-Saxon, or Germanic gods and goddesses. These are the same gods and goddesses that the Vikings and pre-Vikings worshipped. Heathenism is open to anyone who feels a closeness to such gods and goddesses. So, obviously, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate between very sincere people about what heathenism really is, and I'm sure within that world, people are debating specific elements of heathenism and what constitutes heathenism, etc. Throughout the poem, when Chesterton talks about the heathen, I think he's really just using the term very broadly to mean the sort of non-Christian, somebody who doesn't hold themselves necessarily to the Christian set of moral expectations and virtues. And it's funny, I found out recently that it's actually one of the reasons Chesterton converted to Christianity is he didn't like the laxity and decadence that he saw present in his time, which is, to me, always funny to think about, considering that he lived so long ago. Not too long ago, but over 100 years ago, and already he felt he needs more religion in his life because his society and culture is too decadent. That sounds a lot like what's happening now, where a lot of people are returning to religion, perhaps returning to the good, just because they are overwhelmed by the amount of evil they see around them. Of course, as we go through this poem, you're going to see that Chesterton actually thinks that people who don't hold themselves to the constricts or the limitations that Christian morality expects on someone who's trying to live their life in accordance with Christ, I think Chesterton is sort of taken aback that you would live your life in sin but then not do it to the utmost, which is a very interesting idea. And it relates to something he also says in the introductory poem to his novel, The Man Who Was Thursday. And in that introductory poem, he has this line which goes, they twisted even decent sins to shapes not to be named. They twisted even decent sins to shapes not to be named. Okay, so obviously being playful, but this idea that the heathen doesn't even know how to sin properly. The heathen doesn't even know how to really be a heathen. And so the premise and the main recurring theme of this poem is if I was a heathen, I would do X, Y, Z. But Higgins, which is the character he kind of teases throughout the poem, Higgins is a heathen, but he's just not living the life to the fullest. He's not embracing what heathenry really means. And it's such a witty idea at its core, and the way he breaks it down is just so beautiful. So let's go through the poem together. I do think it's underrated just because I mean, okay, so maybe I should just make a quick point here on, I guess when we say something is underrated, I think oftentimes that probably does come down to a subjective feeling about our exposure to something, because in my personal experience, I just haven't heard this poem ever mentioned by somebody. And when I'm going online and I'm reading about Chesterton, or people are talking about Chesterton's great poems, I don't ever see this one being mentioned. So at least in my own experience, it does seem to be quite underrated. So let's get started with it. It begins by saying, "If I had been a heathen, I'd have praised the purple vine. My slaves should dig the vineyards, and I would drink the wine. But Higgins is a heathen, and his slaves grow lean and grey, that he may drink some tepid milk exactly twice a day." So already right off the bat, right, of course he's saying, if I was a non-believer, if I wasn't holding myself to the restrictions I feel are placed upon me in the framework of redemption and salvation and sin, if I didn't have that, what would I praise? Well, I wouldn't praise God, but I wouldn't praise the true God, but I would praise the purple vine. I would praise wine. And I would have slaves, and I would make sure that they dig the vineyards, so that I could continue drinking that wine that I praise. But then he brings up Higgins, who is this heathen, but he's not even, he's not giving his due to this evil. And so even his slaves are growing lean and grey. They're being kind of deprived of any work. And I'm doing my best to try and explain this. They're not being... he's so bad at being evil, in a sense, is one way I could put it. He's so bad at expressing his heathenry that even the evil he would do is somehow failing. Then he does all this just so he can drink some tepid milk, and he does it exactly twice a day. So it's this very scheduled, routine approach to things, which is also an idea you're going to see again and again. This lack of spontaneity that you might expect with the heathen is just not there in this heathen that Chesterton's pointing out. He then says, "If I had been a heathen, I'd have crowned naras curls." So this is something I thought I would just Google with you guys. I Googled it a few years ago, naras curls, and I believe it's a myth, which I feel like I should know. Naras curls. I probably spelled it incorrectly. Let's see. Okay, I'm getting the same poem here. I'd have crowned naras curls. Oh man, I actually don't know what this means. I've completely forgotten. I'll have to look it up and then do a follow-up, or just send a message on the community tab explaining it. Let's continue reading. "If I'd been a heathen, I'd have crowned naras curls and filled my life with love affairs, my house with dancing girls. But Higgins is a heathen, and to lecture rooms is forced, where his aunts who are not married demand to be divorced." So, he would have affairs. He would have women walking around his house entertaining him, essentially giving in to all lust and permitting himself to commit adultery, because why not, right? Because I am fully a heathen and I'm going to embrace it. But this is not what Higgins does. Higgins is a heathen, and yet he's forced to go and teach academia. He's forced to be in lecture rooms. He's forced to be in a kind of stiff environment where he has to do certain things and say certain things, and he doesn't embrace this freedom of heathenry. And even to the point where he has familial issues that he's dealing with, where aunts aren't even married, but they're demanding to be divorced, just showing the sort of absurdity of the everyday life experiences he has to undergo, even as a heathen. He then says, if I had been a heathen, I'd have sent my armies forth and dragged behind my chariots the chieftains of the north, right? So just committing all sorts of horrors towards other human beings, right? What are the reasons not to, other than maybe socially constructed reasons which I might entertain as a heathen, but really don't bear the weight of any serious existential threat to my soul. There's nothing ultimately wrong with doing this. At least I can't justify the wrong of doing this, so I will give in to this as I am a heathen. But Chesterton says, but Higgins is a heathen, but he just what he drives is not a chariot, but he drives the dreary quill, this dreary pen, so that he can lend the poor that funny cash that makes them poorer still, so that he can essentially pretty much just take advantage of others, right? So he's in a sense taking advantage of others here, but he's doing it in a very specific, very controlled way. He's not letting himself go. He's not letting himself embrace his heathenry. And I think Chesterton's point here is, are you really even a heathen? And that's going to come right back to us at the end of the poem, because then Chesterton says, if I had been a heathen, I'd have piled my pyre on high, and in a great red whirlwind gone roaring to the sky. But Higgins is a heathen, and a richer man than I, and they put him in an oven just as if he were a pie. So here Chesterton is talking about cremation, and he's saying that if he was a heathen, and he was going to die, he'd have taken his whole pyre, he would have put everything he has in this giant pyre, and he would have just let it burn, and he would have gone out in this major, intense scene. And yet Higgins is a heathen, and he just gets cremated, he gets baked like a pie. Where's your passion? Where's your embrace of heathenry? And then he says, just to round off the poem, now who that runs can read it, the riddle that I write, of why this poor old sinner should sin without delight. But I cannot read it, although I run and run, of them that do not have the faith and will not have the fun. Okay, so such a great point here. So now he says, now who that runs can read it, the riddle that I write. So he is, in a way, technically I guess it's not a riddle, but it seems riddle-like in the sense that there's a few things going on here, right? On the one hand, it's almost like a tongue-in-cheek critique of heathens who aren't really living out their heathenry. And at the same time, it's kind of reflecting on our own fallen nature and thinking, yes, if I really allowed myself to do whatever I wanted, what kind of a monster would I be, right? The horrible things I would do to others as laid out throughout the poem. And yet, Higgins somehow still seems to be constrained by something, even though he calls himself a heathen, and even though he thinks he is this maybe superior person because he's not tied down by any sort of conventional morality. Yet, if you look at his actions, his life is just as absurd and just as mundane as the next person. So Chesterton goes on and he says, this riddle, what is this riddle about? Well, it's about this poor old sinner, Higgins, who's the sinner, but he sins without delight. He just doesn't even enjoy his sins, right? You'd think that one of the main reasons people do sin is because they find temporary gratification in it. He says, not even here Higgins finds that. And then he says, but I cannot read it. I can't understand this riddle. So I can't understand this riddle that I've written, even though I try and try, although I run and run. But I just can't understand those who do not have the faith, the heathens, but they just don't have the fun that comes with that lack of moral restriction. Now, of course, ultimately, we know that these kinds of lack of moral restrictions and just simply allowing yourself to do whatever you want ultimately is probably going to lead to some very deep form of suffering if you're not careful, if you're not tempering that with some kind of balance. But it's a great poem because it's so tongue-in-cheek. I think it kind of makes me think back to my days when I was completely rebelling against Christianity, and I think back and I think, wow, I was actually still very tame. I don't think I really allowed myself to fully go to the ends of what it would mean if I really thought that there was no ultimate good or ultimate evil. And here we have a great example of Chesterton, I think, in his peak, kind of being witty and playful. I don't think he's mocking Higgins here, by the way. I think he's sort of curious and trying to understand the kind of person that embraces sin, yet doesn't know what to do with it. Anyway, guys, like I said, this is going to be a short one. I just wanted to go through this poem and try and clarify my own thoughts on it. I think it's definitely a tricky poem to elucidate the exact meaning of, because like I said, I think a lot of things are going on here, but I just wanted to share it with you. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope that if you didn't know about it, that it is something that maybe enlivens you and challenges the way you think about what it means to be a heathen. Anyway, guys, I'm Dylan. This has been Existential Delight. Nice short one this evening. I hope you're having a wonderful week so far.